Alors, pour les francophones qui se joignent à nous aujourd'hui, on va vous inviter de vous servir du service d'interprétation. Alors, dans le bas à droite sur votre écran, trouvez le bouton écrit Interprétation. Choisissez Français. Et si vous voulez, vous pouvez couper la version audio originale en faisant cette sélection-là pour ne pas entendre la présentation en anglais en arrière-plan. Et pour parler dans la séance pour les francophones, vous n'avez qu'à éteindre l'interprétation et d'activer votre micro, mais vraiment, on va se servir du Q&A dans le bas à droite. Pour un service technique, veuillez utiliser le chat. And if you're Anglophone, you don't need to do anything. The session will be in English. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Meyer to start us off.
Ani bonjour, Meyer Greenfield Indigenous, Giwe no Winkwed Donjaba, Kibwak First Nation Donjaba, Giwe no Winkwed Endayang, and Nourish Donoki. Welcome everybody. I'm really happy that you're here today, and thank you for taking time to join us for a screening of why hospital food matters for reconciliation. We like to begin our gathering by inviting my friend George Cucci to open. George is a knowledge keeper from Nipissing First Nation, and he shares cultural and historical teachings with many folks in and around Ontario. He works closely with hospitals, schools, first responders, and communities to share understandings of cultural mindfulness and how these teachings are important to understand when working alongside and welcoming Indigenous communities into our organizations. George has also helped us out with this film and the messages that we carefully have woven together to share with everyone today. So take it away, George. Miigwech.
Bonjour, Dishnakaj Gibawanasa Nipissing Doshaba. Welcome to the traditional territory of Nipissing First Nation. And I thank my good friend Meyer again for asking me to help with the opening. A lot of things in the media the last few days, a lot of negative things. And what I always tell people that not only is the police broken, but the courts are broken and the hospitals are broken. And that one man's actions or one man's voice can change 7 generations to come. And I'm so glad to be part of Nourish, because I think Nourish is going to be that generation that we can talk about that made a positive impact in our communities, even in our hospitals. So I asked the Creator today to help us in our journeys, to look after us. I asked the 4 winds to keep us in their arms. And I also asked the Creator to look over our families and to keep us safe. And I say miigwech. Thank you.
Miigwech, George and Meyer, and welcome again to everyone, including the 12-person team you see kind of at the top of your screen, on the right of your screen, some of the panelists, Nourish team members you'll be hearing from today, whose voices will come in progressively over this session. And thank you to all of you who have joined us for this launch, for sharing your lunch with us today. So my name is Haley Lapalme, co-director at Nourish and an 11th generation French-Canadian settler living and working here in Treaty 13, where spring is coming out. And this is a territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty that is really vivid in imagery to describe the commitments between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and subsequently other nations as well who were brought into the treaty, including the Mississaugas, to peaceably share and steward this land around the Great Lakes. So the imagery of a spoon is a reminder for those who share the land to share as they ensure the dish is always full. The parallel rows of the wampum belt illustrate the distinct trajectories and integrity of all the nations who were here and who continue to be here today. Images are one of the ways we make meaning and we convey stories, and we're here today to share one, a story about how, as treaty people, it's time for us to look to some of the original foodways that covered Tuttle Island for guidance on how we might address some of the biggest health disparities that mark our country. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit us 1 year ago, Nourish had already been doing work around Indigenous foodways for 4 or 5 years already, really taking shape in the work led by the traditional foods team and the Nourish Innovator cohort, many of you who are on the call. And that team shared work and learning around the opportunities to get traditional food into healthcare and raised awareness around the barriers of persistent colonial paradigms and regulations that kept it out of those very settings where it was most needed. So when the pandemic struck, our team hosted a few national learning calls to support community and health leaders to exchange about how they were addressing Indigenous food insecurity that was exacerbated by the pandemic. Again, many of you who are registered for that call today were on that call, on those calls. And from there, the Frontline Fund, which is made up of 160 hospital foundations across the country, they got behind our team's efforts with the Nourish Food RX Fund to give out grants to Indigenous focused or Indigenous led projects that used food as a way not only to support efforts to combat the pandemic, but also to build back better from it. Which for me, among equal and interconnected priorities like turning towards the climate crisis, means really to seize this critical opportunity to confront systemic racism that is deeply and often quietly, though not always, embedded in our health system, and to find a way to use this breaking point of the pandemic to choose a better way forward. Today, in one short film, you will witness 4 stories. An overarching story of erasure and loss that started with European contact in North America, and 3 stories from Food RX project teams that show how communities and hospitals are looking to pre-contact Indigenous foodways as a way to bring health to patients and communities. Work that Indigenous communities have been doing forever, and that healthcare leaders are increasingly looking toward. So the Nourish Indigenous and Allies Advisory, which is made up of many of the original members of the traditional foods team, they stewarded this project, which was co-written by Maya Greenfield and George Cucci, who you've just heard from, and by myself and by Scott Baker, the filmmaker at Adjacent Possibilities, who's behind 2 other Nourish films many of you have probably seen, the Ode to the Hospital Tray and Meacham films. So as a settler and an Indigenous team working together, we also collaborated with editors and animators and 3 Indigenous cinematographers who helped bring the story to life that you're about to see. And Nourish's own Maya Greenfield hosts the film, and she is going to follow up afterward with some insights about how you and your organizations can get involved in the future of this work. So finally, my hope for this film is that it will make it really impossible for us to be bystanders in shaping the future that is emerging, and that it cues us how much we all stand to gain when we start to recognize and value all the forms of wisdom that are available to us, when we learn to fill the dish and share the spoon with greater awareness that our well-being is interconnected. Mostly, I'm grateful to the Indigenous community and health leaders who share their knowledge and wisdom through their Food RX work and all the other good work they're doing, and to settler healthcare leaders who undertake a big journey into humility and hard work to learn how to respectfully bring traditional foods into our institutions. This is messy and imperfect work, and so this film will not be without its flaws. But I look forward to your questions and reactions later on in our conversation. So without further ado, I pass it over to Kelly Gordon, who is co-chair of the Nourish Indigenous and Allies Advisory, to do the setup for our film.
Niao Haley, Sego Seguego. My name is Kelly Gordon. I'm Mohawk, and I work as a registered dietitian and health promotion team manager at Six Nations Health Services. I'm honored to be here today to support the launch of Why Hospital Food Matters for Reconciliation. Beginning in 2017, I was part of the original Nourish cohort and the Traditional Foods Program team. As a team of innovators from across the nation, we work towards increasing availability and accessibility to Indigenous traditional foods in healthcare settings. Knowing that this work was not easy. Fast forward to 2020, through the growth and continuation of Nourish, the Indigenous and Allies Advisory formed to support the continued work that Nourish has been doing. I'm proud to still be supporting and working with the Nourish team, and so proud of the work we have accomplished to date. The launch of this film holds so much meaning to me and offers hope and looks to make the promise of reconciliation a reality, as Indigenous communities are leading and showing us the way. Following the film, please stay on to join a panel discussion with Stephanie, Ben, and Raven, all whose health organizations are represented in the film you'll see today. A few quick comments. So please, most of you have mute yourselves as we play the film. If the film doesn't play on Zoom, so if it doesn't work tech-wise for you, there will be a link for the English film in the chat. I'm going to ask Rachel to just explain for our French-speaking viewers the French-speaking link. Rachel, I'll pass it over to you.
Yep, so we have a French-speaking, we have a version of the film in French. Donc, nous avons une version avec des sous-titres en français sur Vimeo. Ce n'est qu'une version préliminaire pour le lancement aujourd'hui. Donc, nous vous demandons de ne pas partager la vidéo. Je vais maintenant entrer le lien et le mot de passe dans le clavardage ou le chat. I will now enter the link and the password for the French version, as well as the version for English into the chat.
Merci, Rachel. So in addition to the viewing, there'll be both a chat. So we ask if you use the chat for your comments and your reaction. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's also a Q&A. This is a new feature of Zoom to me, but this is where we would ask you to put your questions for the Q&A or for the panel that we're going to have following the film. So use the Q&A for film questions, chat for reactions. So without further ado, I'll pass it over for Meyer to launch the film. Enjoy, everyone.
In her last moments. You see it over and over again, and it needs to stop.
When the media reported the story, many Canadians were shocked and horrified. For Indigenous communities, this was especially traumatizing. But it wasn't surprising. We experience racism every day as we navigate our lives in Canada. It's part of the long legacy of abuses like the Indian Act, residential schools, Indian hospitals, and a persistent belief that Indigenous ways of being are inferior to Western ones. These legacies have intergenerational effects that create ongoing barriers within education, the media discourse, government institutions, and yes, healthcare. Joy Seshaquan's death jolted healthcare leaders to recognize that systemic racism exists in our system. But where does it come from? Where else does it exist? And how can healthcare institutions begin to unravel it? Ane Bojo, Meyer Greenfield Indigenous, Kibwak First Nation Donjaba, Giwe no Winkwed Donjaba, Giwe no Winkwed Endayang, Nourish Ndonoki. You've probably seen photos in the media of $23 asparagus, a $71 watermelon, and an $18 cabbage for sale in northern Indigenous communities. With the remote nature of these communities, the fresh and healthy foods that is shipped there is expensive compared to highly processed foods. The story of the $18 cabbage is only the tip of the iceberg. Traditional and country foodways have provided nourishment for Indigenous communities for thousands of years. The land and water feeds us, and this food is our medicine. But through colonization, the land was stolen and the children were forced into residential schools where they were forbidden from learning the knowledge and culture of their ancestors. Hunting, fishing, harvesting wild foods, and the Indigenous foodways that supported our communities were impacted. I have heard elders say that these will take up to 7 generations to rebuild. These factors are why communities have rates of diet-related illness like diabetes and heart disease that are double the Canadian average. This is part of an Indigenous health gap. where in almost every measure of health, Indigenous communities experience far worse outcomes than the rest of Canada. How do we close this gap? The solutions lie in our communities. For generations, knowledge keepers protected the cultural wisdom and relationship to the land that colonial policies tried to erase. And today, there is a movement of communities across Turtle Island who are strengthening traditional foodways. In recent years, many Canadian healthcare institutions have responded to this movement and started to examine their own colonial practices. They are building relationships with knowledge keepers and using their influence and purchasing power to support this movement.
So the Food is Medicine was a month-long program that we ran revolving around traditional foods as medicine. So we had different elders and different knowledge keepers in each area speak to the sessions that we were putting on each week. We did a few Zoom sessions, and then we had a couple Facebook Lives as well as how-to videos. We also had different corresponding kits that went along with the different sessions that we held. So we had ice fishing kits, wild rice kits. It engaged a lot of community members to participate in something that maybe they wouldn't have participated in otherwise. Kind of wanted to bring back that feeling of community and that feeling of unity in the communities. There's just so much problems with just everything that had to do with colonialism and, you know, all of the knowledge that was lost and the language that was lost. And we're in a state now where youth are kind of reclaiming that and they want to learn more about, you know, where this food comes from and how our people used to survive here. My mom was a part of the 60s Scoop, and so I grew up away from my culture, away from my language, and I've just kind of been regaining it. I think it's just really important to get back to those teachings and to learn from the elders that are still here today, because when they're gone, I don't know how else we're gonna learn the knowledge that they have to teach us.
Our first goal was to add more traditional food items to our hospital menus across Saskatchewan. But our second and more important goal was really to engage our staff and inspire our work teams in a path towards cultural humility. We thought rather than just finding a recipe and trialing it with a few folks and then adding it to our menu, we really wanted to take the time to engage the staff. So to do this, we invited 5 well-known local Indigenous chefs from across Saskatchewan to our food production center in Saskatoon and asked them to prepare their favorite traditional meal using the local ingredients that were available and telling the stories of their food and their culture. Hospital menus really have not paid a lot of attention to the cultural and traditional needs of the patients. And I think this is particularly important for Indigenous cultures because food is so intertwined with health and healing. I think that it really presents a unique opportunity to find those ways to engage your work teams and to begin that culture shift.
So the dream for me is, healthy communities, healthy elders, and eating their own traditional foods. So the initiative was to reach out to Indigenous communities in the Interior Health Service area, to chat with community members, to look for recipes that are from the community, developed by the community, consumed in the community, and apply that, if we can, into dinner at home format. We have a need in healthcare to get traditional foods into the healthcare system, into long-term care systems, into elder centers. We have recipes coming in, we have communities engaged, we have source product that we can use for these dinner at homes that are traditionally harvested. It's one step at a time. And we were asked point blank, I was asked point blank, what are we going to do with the recipes? What am I going to do with the recipes? And what I've shared with the communities is the recipes aren't going anywhere. We will do this work, we will get it back to the community, and we will wait for feedback before this information goes anywhere, and then we will ask the community if they're interested in sharing it. I think it's important to culturally connect with your community, culturally connect with your past, and see that value. I think food is the most important part of a culture. It's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's a question of who's going to do it.
There is a growing recognition that if we want to decolonize our institutions, close the Indigenous health gap, and make the promise of reconciliation a reality, it's time to unlearn old ways of thinking, confront biases in our institutions, and recognize the power of Indigenous foodways to transform healthcare. Indigenous communities are showing us the way, and when healthcare commits its resources and energy to this cause, they are practicing anchor leadership. Leadership that harnesses the resources and wisdom within healthcare and community to build health for all and to help build back better. If this is your healthcare institution, join our movement of anchor leaders.
All right, thank you everyone. Just to acknowledge the tech glitch at the beginning of the film, we did have it on mute for the first few seconds. And just want to acknowledge and say the name of Joyce Ekwan and know that she was presented in the beginning of the film. She was an Indigenous woman who recently died in healthcare. And because of the racist structure that exists, it's pretty unbelievable. And knowing that this is the conversation, this is the reality of many of our healthcare systems. And part of the promotion and direction we've received from the Indigenous voice around the Allies Circle, Indigenous and Allies Advisory Circle, is that we need to acknowledge the racism that exists. And if we're going to be talking about food, and how food is culture and food is identity and food is essential, food is our medicine, that this conversation needs to start from a place of healing and reconciliation. So our apologies for that glitch at the beginning. The link is shared. Everyone hopefully can be viewing it. You're welcome to share it. And I invite you now to stay on and enjoy a conversation with some of our panelists. For me, like I said, it's a moment of pride. I just feel so proud to be a part of this project and to see how far we've come, and to not only see this happening in our communities and Indigenous communities, but in large health authorities, Saskatchewan Health Authority, BC Interior Health. This isn't just the work that needs to happen for and within Indigenous people. It needs to be led by us, but this is the work that needs to happen in the whole entire healthcare system. And so we're hopeful that this messaging goes out, that it is a responsibility of everyone. Food is a great way to start and begin these conversations, but doing it in a way of respect and doing it in a way where it can prompt and promote reconciliation. And that's really how this pathway and this dialogue has come out of the conversations from Nourish and those that I've been involved in. So again, just really excited to see this out. And again, the movement over the last 3 to 4 years of involvement. So I now invite Stephanie Cook, Ben Genaille, and Raven Crow to just have a quick conversation. I have a few questions prepared for each of you. Perhaps I'll start with Stephanie. So I want to look at, Stephanie Cook from Saskatchewan Health Authority, who you just saw in the film. Stephanie, what impact have you seen on patients? Has there been any early feedback about the impact of bringing traditional food into their care?
Thanks for the question, Kelly. Nice to see you. Like you, I share, I'm so grateful for the experience of Nourish and the work of the traditional foods team to just highlight the essential need of food and care and how we have the opportunities to do better. And our project has been really exciting for all of us because we're seeing the enthusiasm from amongst the team, but we're also seeing enthusiasm from our patients. We've trialed many different food items, 40 to be exact, have been developed based on traditional recipes provided by our 5 chefs from across Saskatchewan. And feedback from our patients has been fantastic, just really feeling like we're listening. And I think that's the most important piece. And I did want to share, I received some feedback just very recently from a patient, and the patient's comments, and I will share them because they're right in front of me here, was that this patient told me that coming to hospital and having to eat mostly non-traditional food items reminded her of her days in residential schools. She told me stories of being forced to eat Western food in her residential school and now could no longer eat pork and meat based on that trauma. She was so happy to hear that traditional foods are now being integrated into the hospital setting, as it would help foster her intake and help for healing of Aboriginal and Indigenous patients. And I think it is that just receiving those messages they're so heartwarming, and they really tell us that we're on the right path. And I think that's the most important piece to this, is when we get the feedback from the patients that we're intending to impact with this. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. And just to note, Stephanie was also part of the original Nourish Innovator cohort. So it's amazing to see the work that you guys have been doing in Saskatchewan and within the health authority, specifically around this work. And the one thing I appreciate so much was your point, firstly, to get traditional food into the hospital, but secondly, and more importantly, as you noted, to engage the staff. So it's that piece around education. It's that piece around answering the why. We always are asked, well, why is this important? And does this really involve me? And you guys have done that. And it's amazing to see, and congratulations on the work. And thank you for sharing that. Next, Ben Genaille. So Ben is from the British Columbia Interior Health. Question for you, Ben. What can others learn from the process you took to request the recipes from the community and elders respectfully? Why is this important? So I don't see Ben's video. Ben, are you there? I might move on to Raven, and we'll see if Ben comes back. I just see, I think his video might have gotten turned off. So I'll move on to Raven. So Raven works in a health access center in Kenora, so in Northwestern Ontario. So Raven is here on behalf of her organization. You saw Jade in the film, who I've heard is a close friend of Raven's as well. So Raven, in the film, your colleague Jade says that youth are reclaiming their culture and traditional foodways. As this continues to happen, how do you think your community's health could be impacted?
So overall, I think it would be impacted in a positive way, just because they're reclaiming their culture and their traditions by learning how to hunt, learning how to harvest, where to harvest, like the food. For example, like hunting is like physically demanding, and learning how to do that. I'm trying to teach my kids, and I'm trying to learn as well. And just so many teachings come from that. So it shows that we're connected to the land. We get all our food from the land, trap lines, hunting, fishing, gardening, harvesting. It shows who our community assets are, like the hunters, the knowledge keepers. They know where to access everything. So yeah, it just impacts everything: life expectancy, happiness, physical health, nutrition, mental health. So yeah, it impacts in a good, positive way.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And I think for me, Jade spoke of food as medicine, and just seeing the kits, like the wild rice kits, the ice fishing kits that youth and families can engage in together, and that sort of resurgence and those reconnections or connections to our traditional foods and all those good things that they promote that you just mentioned. So it's so exciting to see how well you guys are putting that out, the reception from your communities and surrounding First Nations communities. It's awesome. So again, thank you for sharing. Ben, I think you're back now. Ben, I have a question for you. So again, Ben from Interior Health BC, what can others learn from the process you took to request the recipes from community elders respectfully? Why is it important to do this?
First I'd like to acknowledge Donna Koning, who's on the call and really responsible for this taking place. Reaching out to the communities and sharing the work that we're doing and how we're going about it was so important in the beginning to me, that we can acknowledge the respect and acknowledge the knowledge that that possibly share with us. So that was the first part. That was the most important value, I think, in reaching out to the communities and having them share their knowledge with us, share their recipes with us, that they understood that we were doing good work at the end of the day for communities, for healthcare, and hoping to change the system and educate the system really in the traditional value and nourishment and that's available in traditional foods.
Yeah, I can't agree more, Ben, and I appreciate, you know, how you comment about doing it with respect. And when the community is like, well, what are you going to do if we give you these recipes? And you said nothing until we get your consent and your permission to share these or to utilize these, and doing that in a good way. And one of the biggest, most important things, I think, as we connect to our land, as we understand the original peoples of the land or the territory that we live on, how do we build those relationships with Indigenous peoples? How do we allow them to provide their knowledge and guidance in the processes that we'll be proceeding in around food? And those relationships, those engagements that Stephanie talked about, all of that is essential in this process. And sometimes originally we talked about how do we get food into hospitals? We had to step back. There's so many more steps that you need to take, that you need to consider to move through this process. And we're hopeful that through these messages, through the work through Nourish, that we're promoting that and providing information and just guidance on how others can be following along. So thank you to all three of you, and for what you shared and your commitment to the film. It's a wonderful product, and again, really proud to be a part of it. We're going to move to a few questions. I've opened up the Q&A. And maybe Haley, is there one or two questions there you wanted me to highlight that you've seen come in?
Sure. So there was one from Diane Jansen, and she asked, have there been partnerships with Indigenous food suppliers in the projects that have been started?
So yeah, sorry. Does anyone on the panel want to speak to that? Maybe Stephanie, is there any partnerships with Indigenous food suppliers in the projects within Saskatchewan Health Authority? Any comments to that?
Thanks, Kelly. We did. We wanted all of our recipes to have as many locally grown traditional ingredients that we could get our hands on. So we tried really hard to look far and wide through some of our regular supply chains for Indigenous traditional foods. But our best resource was our chefs and our elders who were part of the event. They were able to track down ingredients like we'd never seen before. So even through this process, we added close to 50 different suppliers to our list of how do we get our hands on some of these ingredients that are so critical to this whole piece. So I think that was our big learning, is they're not that readily available, and you have to really look hard.
Great. Ben or Raven, anything to comment further on that question?
I think that's great, Stephanie. You found that many suppliers, but it is just some work that has to go into it, to sourcing these ingredients. I believe they're out there in most provinces. In BC, we have a lot of waterways here, so getting seafood for our menu items was relatively easy to connect with them, and we introduced them to one of the big food suppliers that Interior Health works with. So hopefully there's economic development for them as well going forward. But I think if you look, you'll find it, and these sorts of things are going on in communities, especially I know about BC, and it's a growing market for sure. So I think there's great opportunity for the communities as well. Miigwech.
Thank you. And I think it's something that we're often presented with. You know, we know, for example, moose is a traditional meat that is eaten by many Indigenous communities, but you can't, it's hard to access moose, right? So I think it's looking at the diversity that exists within our food systems. There's so many types of foods that are hunted and gathered and farmed, and they fly and they swim in all sorts of ways. So I think it's really about understanding the diversity within our food systems can help promote and prompt access to them. Thanks to both of you. I was going to move on to another question. It's a bit more for the behind the scenes crew around how the film was made. So a question from Jen. She says, can you tell us about making of this film? How did the pandemic affect your production decisions? So good question. I'm just wondering if Haley or Meyer want to chime in on that one.
COVID made it interesting, didn't it? So we did land on a totally kind of like virtual remote COVID safe screening. So it meant instead of working, I think often we would work with, a cinematographer. Instead, we worked with 4. That was really cool because, Ben was talking about opportunities for the like economic part of reconciliation. Similarly, it was a chance to be working with different filmmakers and give them an opportunity. But I'll pass it over to the people who are on screen. What was it like for you? You did Zoom interviews, you did socially distanced interviews in place.
I can chime in first, Haley. It was a lot of fun. We filmed actually here in my living room. We had a lot of safe equipment here, so it was a little bit eerie, but fun at the same time. And then Scott we Zoomed him in, so he was on a meeting from Toronto. So it was actually quite remarkable for him because Lindsay Sarrazin, who we worked with, has some pretty amazing technology. So he was able to see it as if he was here. So we had a lot of fun with it.
Great. I think we have time maybe for one more question. Haley, can you help me out with the French question?
Sure. So there is a question that's asking whether the Ministry of Health in Quebec confirms the food safety for the health network in Quebec when we talk about wild food and game. So est-ce que le MAPAC confirme la salubrité des aliments autochtones lors de ce qu'on parle aujourd'hui? This is a tricky one. So Kelly and others, I think the question of food safety, I think, is one of the places that we see a pattern of ongoing colonization playing out. And we see really diverse place-based responses, like slowly getting figured out across the country around this. But do you want to speak to this a bit more, Kelly, Stephanie, Ben? I think we got a note that says that Raven just lost connection due to a power outage in her community. So I guess she won't be able to answer for now. But yeah, over to you 3.
I think, again, it's a very common question when we're looking at, insertion of a type of food in a hospital and is it safe? And for me, it's about going back to the knowledge that we hold within our communities. And these are foods that we've always ate, we've prepared in ways, and we have to trust this process. And like Haley mentioned, with the colonial structures that are in place within our healthcare system specifically, it can be a huge barrier. So a lot of this work is to offer that education, to build those relationships, to establish that trust and how that can promote, I want to say prompt and promote, but I prompt it into one word. It can help promote the inclusion of these foods and the presence of these foods and doing it in a different way. So that's the challenge for us, is kind of really thinking about how we do this differently, because the way that it's not working. So that's part of the guidance that I can offer. That doesn't specifically speak to mandates and guidelines and what needs to be done. It's how do we start to question and challenge those things that are in place, because knowing that they're not meeting the needs of the patients and they're not speaking to reconciliation. Stephanie or Ben, any further comments or experiences?
I'll just add to that, Kelly, that we have, I think, made some really tremendous headway in Saskatchewan with the support of our ministries of health and agriculture to move forward this I guess, archaic idea that traditional or for Indigenous foods are somehow not safe, or, at some other level of risk. And uninspected meat is somehow at risk. So we've been working really closely with them and feel really positive about the steps we're taking, and feel like, when we look at the language that says, people have a right to food that is safe and representative of their culture. We have a responsibility to really start pushing those policies and saying, you know, we can't say this and then not act. So I think that we're getting really close in Saskatchewan, and I think there's lots of exciting things to come from that.
Great. Ben, anything to add to that?
Certainly. I think, you know, knowing the HACCP language and the food safe language and sharing that information when you're chatting with those that make policy is very valuable, and we can, you know, reach out from both sides to learn from each other and provide the information that they're looking for as far as policy. But we also have to look at, you know, the traditional foods that have been consumed here, you know, for millennia, and the foods that were shared with the first settlers to nourish them and keep them alive, and showing them what to eat and what not to eat. And now we seem to be defending that way of life and those foods. So it's just kind of puzzling at times, but I think education is the key. Yeah.
Great. Thank you to both Stephanie and Ben, and to Raven, who unfortunately lost power. I think because of time, I'm going to conclude our panel today, and just again say nyawa to each of the panelists for providing your insights and being a part of this project. I'll pass it back over to Haley.
All right, so we didn't get to all the questions, but fortunately some of our calls to action have some good news that will get to some of the questions that you did raise. Things like, in addition to the food safety, talking about what about when you encounter resistance from your organization, you get pushback for reasons that often come down to cost, food safety, whatever it might be. So Meyer is going to tell you in a second about an Indigenous foodways, our Food is Our Medicine campaign that's launching, and that's going to include some really great resources that show you how others have started to open up the path to do this. So there are really great examples in Thunder Bay, Saskatchewan, Sioux Lookout, up in the Yukon at the Whitehorse General Hospital and elsewhere, where teams have really worked in a place-based way with environmental health, public health, their healthcare administration, to figure out ways to bring traditional food in safely and in a way that respects protocol and the tradition that actually has allowed folks to eat Indigenous foodways since forever safely. So you'll get some support with that. But for now, after seeing this film today, we really wanted to call you to share this film with 3 of your colleagues. We're so grateful to the support from the Frontline Fund for this work, to have been able to make this film. We see lots of comments in the chat about, you know, the rice turning into hair, and just some of we wanted to make something that was beautiful, that you'd feel excited to share, and that can hopefully help you advance these conversations. So our challenge to you is try to share it by the end of the day today with 3 of your colleagues. Maybe you looked at organizing a virtual film screening with your organization. You can reach out to us if you want to do that. Any of the resources that Nourish puts out are open source. We want you to use them and share them as if they were your own. And we do want to invite you into a moment of introspection and thinking about kind of like personal and organizational opportunities to move forward. And like Kelly spoke to, you know, it's not always just jumping to action on something like getting the food into the hospital, but it really starts with building relationships. So, you know, if you're looking for recipes, if you're looking for a way forward, make sure you're doing that in partnership with Indigenous leaders in your community, Indigenous patients that you're serving, elders. So really go and start to build those relationships. And then, yeah, sign up for this Food is Our Medicine campaign that's coming, that Meyer will tell us about next.
Miigwech. So I'd like to share now our Food is Our Medicine. It's a learning journey that is coming on April 21st. So join us again from noon till 2 Eastern Standard Time for the launch of our campaign. We will be launching a resource library and a self-directed learning journey for healthcare leaders to develop and dive deeper into the work of reconciliation, cultural mindfulness, and understanding on how to bring the power of Indigenous knowledge and foodways into healthcare. So We will provide recognition for those to complete the journey, and you can register in the link on this slide, and it will also be in our newsletter, and we'll be sharing on social media, so you'll be able to find it, hopefully with ease. And on that note, I'd like to say miigwech to everybody for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to George Cucci for our closing.
Thank you, Meyer. After watching the video, it inspires me again to do more work in my own community. And this video actually should be shared with schools that helps our young people realize the importance of our medicines, the food. So we thank the Creator for all the gifts that He has given us. Help us walk in a good journey, and to remind us to share our spark with people that may need an extra spark in their life. And I say miigwech. Thank you.